that's saying they should be punished for having left
exactly.
the UK. Dare I say it, there's a bit of dour Presbyterian, I think, in you, perhaps, Michael.
That is true.
If we're going to have this policy, it has to apply to everybody. It can't just be done on the basis of sensibilities.
And you have both a celebration of weakness and an auction for more and more state control, both of which are the opposite of civilization. I'm tempted to say, in a different way, maybe what we should have is an Inequality Act. Hello and welcome to this week's Quite Right Questions and Answers podcast. I'm Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator.
And I'm Madeline Grant, assistant editor and parliamentary sketch writer.
This week, we'll be asking whether or not hard-pressed UK taxpayers should have their money spent on making sure that influencers can come back from Dubai while their tan is still intact. We'll also be considering the Equality Act. Is it a monstrous piece of legislation that urgently needs repeal? And we'll be considering which right-wing leaders around the world we admire. Everyone, I'm sure, will agree with Maddie, and as usual, most people will tell me that I'm completely wrong. Our first question is from John Davis, and John asks, should the UK government charge wealthy British expat tax exiles for the cost of travel on RAF aircraft from the Gulf states to Britain? Or should the cost of their rescue from the Gulf be borne by the British taxpayers who've remained in the UK and paid their taxes here? Well, I think we know what John thinks. What do you think, Maddie?
I just think it's a very interesting principle that John opens up, the idea that you have to currently be contributing to the Exchequer to get anything from the British state. If you want to play that game, John, let's play it and see what happens. But on a serious point, I think there has been a nasty, vengeful, spiteful and very envious reaction to what's happening in Dubai. The idea that there has to be some kind of divine retribution for people who, for whatever reason, may have left the UK and moved to a country. And often, there's this idea that it's all these kind of plutocratic tax exiles. I know people who've moved to Dubai because they don't want to raise their kids in some British cities because they don't feel it's safe. There are a host of different reasons, a host of different types of people there. And we never apply this rule to anybody else. There was no question of evacuating people from Sudan, dual nationals should be charged, etc., for the price of the flight. I think what it's unlocked is a kind of nasty snobbery about these people, frankly, who some consider to be a bit gauche and kind of Dino-like. Yeah, exactly. And it's even become a political talking point. Ed Davey in PMQs last week, I think, basically started wanging on about Isabel Oakeshott for some reason.
Spectator contributor
Isabel Oakeshott. And you can see that his brain has been fried by spending too much time on social media, and he's appealing to the worst instincts of his own voters.
We rightly expect our brave armed forces to protect British citizens around the world in crises like this. But that includes tax exiles like Isabel Oakeshott and washed-up old footballers who mock ordinary people who stay in the UK and pay our taxes here. So as we protect them, does the Prime Minister agree it is only right for tax exiles to start paying taxes to fund our armed forces just like the rest of us?
I think you're right. I think the fact that whenever Ed Davey goes into battle against someone, my heart and my sword naturally leap to their defence. So even though I'm not a great fan of people being tax exiles, nevertheless, I thought it was ungallant, unchivalrous and illiberal for Ed Davey to target Isabel Oakeshott and the British citizens in Dubai in that way. There's a bit of me, maybe it's chippy, maybe it's snobby, maybe it's both, that sees the point of John Davis's question, that while the rest of us are paying our taxes, there are people who are living it up in the Gulf who, when the drone hits the fan, feel that it's up to the British government and the British taxpayer to protect them. But
you want them to, that's saying they should be punished for having left the UK.
Exactly.
And that's a very, dare I say it, there's a bit of dour Presbyterian, I think, in you, perhaps, Michael.
That is true. But the bigger thing...
Like, I don't love Dubai either. I'm not enamoured with... there's things about Dubai that I find tacky, and I just let's be... If we're going to have this policy, it has to apply to everybody. It can't just be done on the basis of sensibilities.
The bigger thing for me, though, is that no matter how plump your lips or how pristine your bank account or how many influencer retweets you have, if you've got a British passport, the British state should defend you. So One of my formative experiences studying history at school was Palmerston and Don Pacifico. People will, I'm sure, remember, all our readers will remember that Don Pacifico was a Gibraltarian who found himself embroiled in an unfortunate dégringolade in Athens. Anyway, the Greek mob turned on him, and good old Palmerston sent a gunboat.
Oh, yeah.
To protect Don Pacifico because he was a British citizen, Gibraltarian, British passport. Palmerston made the great speech in the House of Commons defending him. He made the point that in the Roman Empire, all you need to say was "Civis Romanus sum," I am a Roman citizen, and the empire protected you.
Damn right.
We don't have an empire anymore, but we do have. Well, I was about to say we do have a navy. We may go on to that.
Just about. We have a small flotilla of ships.
But we certainly have RAF planes that can protect people. If you're a British citizen, the British state should protect you. And if the British state can't protect British citizens abroad, then that raises a bigger question about our capacity to be respected internationally. So, yes, it is the whole point of British citizenship that you don't necessarily have to conform to my Doer Presbyterian idea of what constitutes good citizenship to get the protection of the RAF or the Royal Navy.
Some of the people in Dubai who are there now will have paid more in the time that they were in the UK. They will have paid hundreds of thousands, millions of pounds. So the idea also that as soon as you leave that you'll become persona non grata, I think it has quite an unpleasant idea of citizenship.
Yes.
The idea that you have to be some kind of on a hamster wheel at all times for the British state, whatever it does to you, and however little you get from it at the best of times, however badly served you are. The second that you leave, even if it's on a temporary basis, I know young people that have moved to Dubai because they want to save up for a few years.
Quite.
And then because they cannot buy a house, or even if on quite a good salary, they don't have family help. They go to Dubai for 3 or 4 years to save up enough that they can put a deposit down on a home. Now, it does not make you some kind of wretched villain, especially when these people have probably contributed more than the average UK citizen, way more, I would say, in many cases. It's just, I think, shows a really deranged view of the relationship between the individual and the state.
It's a very fair point. If it was ever to be the case that the aesthetic and ideological judgment of Ed Davey were to be the determining factor as to whether or not you enjoyed the protection of the British state, then we would be in a very, very sorry position. I think that that would probably mean that if you were an FT or Guardian reader, then the warm embrace of the RAF would be there for you. But Spectator...
That is 100% what they're saying, by the way, because
exactly.
they did not say that the individuals in Sudan or in any part of the world, which is at normal times perhaps more dangerous than Dubai, this is all blown up very recently, they would never argue that they should be abandoned by the British state.
And the other thing is, you're right about Dubai. Dubai, the people there are not quite the spiritual heirs of those who went out with the East India Company in order to extend the boundaries of British commerce in the 17th and 18th century. But if you look back at that time, the people who were actually contributing to Britain becoming wealthier and actually contributing to extending the boundaries of British control and civilization, when they came back, the so-called nabobs, they were scorned by the slightly prissier figures left behind, but actually they were the buccaneers of their time. If we had more of that spirit, whether it's being exhibited in Dubai or elsewhere, it would actually, I suspect, be better for Britain. So as you say, it may be the case that the Deans and the Stacys that Ed Davey so deprecates may not necessarily be everyone's cup of tea, that a Love Island aesthetic may not necessarily
That's
be
so funny. So they're this...
my favoured means of, people making money, but I shouldn't be judging, I should be admiring.
You put Blondie Blue on the front cover of the Spectator.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, it's true.
Sorry, we did.
No, it was me.
Well, I love what you're saying because I've just been rereading Vanity Fair recently. These guys are the Joss Sedleys de nos jours. Amazing.
Yes.
I love it. But the thing about Dubai, though, is that I suppose the difference is that those nabobs that you're talking about, they often became so immersed in the culture that they struggled to adapt when they got back to the UK.
Yes.
So there's a very funny scene in Vanity Fair where they try to make a curry for Joss Sedley at the Sedley home, and it's really spicy. And then Becky Sharp, who's trying to flirt with him, has a bite and it completely blows her head off, and she's trying to remain dignified but failing. Whereas Dubai, it's almost like a society where it's 90% immigrant, but equally those who work there don't really get the same rights as the 10%. So it's almost like an immigrant society, but it sort of works for the benefit of UAE nationals as well. But of course, there's this horrible sort of indentured serfdom that goes on to buttress it. Like, I have no great love of the place, but...
No, it is true that the UAE, does have at the top an elite who have benefited from the cheap labour that they've imported and controlled over time in order to build up their country as both a tourist mecca and a commercial hub. But the other thing is, there is, I think, an unsentimental perception of the national interest that the Emirati leadership have that, if not admirable, is certainly, I think, very robust. So the United Arab Emirates, recognises that political Islam is a danger to stability and security, so they've prescribed the Muslim Brotherhood. B, they recognise that having a competitive tax rate attracts talent, and it's not just influencers, as you point out, it's also people in every trade and profession, including people in tech, who can see in Dubai an opportunity to build and create. And it is also the case, as Isabel Oakeshott records in The Spectator this week, that notwithstanding the Iranian missile attack, day-to-day life in Dubai is marked by the safety that families feel. So being tough on political Islam, having a competitive tax rate and cracking down on street crime are not bad things.
No, and it might actually be a moment for self-reflection here. Why, as a country, many young and talented people feel that they cannot put down roots here, they cannot succeed. And even to get the first rung of the housing ladder, they need to move to a place like Dubai, which, as I say, I have no love for, no real desire to visit, and in many ways immoral. But we have driven people who don't want to leave.
Yes, and we, instead of criticising people who are, for the most part, young and ambitious for themselves and their families, you're right, we should reflect on why it is that people have chosen to leave. And we'll always remember that they are, they're British citizens, they were our neighbours. Let's hope they become our neighbours again soon.
Our next question comes from David Charles. What do you think of Suella Braverman's pledge to repeal the Equality Act 2010 on day one? The horrible Equality Act enables and encourages positive discrimination and the whole DEI culture. While one would clearly hope to see that nonsense undone, repealing an act which itself abolished and replaced all preceding equality legislation is surely heavy-handed. Surely this is a misstep, and she should be embracing a more nuanced unpicking of the status quo.
I do believe that the original intention behind the Equality Act, as the questioner points out, was to deal with the range of legislation that had grown up in order to ensure that discrimination that was exercised towards women on the basis of their sex, towards people on the basis of their ethnicity, or towards people living with disabilities on the basis of those disabilities should be consolidated. And there's a certain rationalist logic to it. The problem is that once you created the Equality Act, it became not the original shield that it should have been, but it then became, as Kemi Badenoch has pointed out, a sword whereby the aggrieved would ask to be added to the list of those with so-called protected characteristics. And then institutions would then be belaboured with that sword if they didn't meet abstract levels of numerical equal outcomes in every conceivable area. So I do think that it is worth going back to the origins of the legislation and trying to prune it back. I can understand why people would want to get rid of the whole thing, but I'm enough of a centrist, discuss, still, to believe that having some form of protection in law against discrimination can and should be a good thing. So therefore, what I'd want to see is a hacking back rather than an entire uprooting.
I think that creates a lot of work for a new government coming in,
yes,
which will have an awful lot of reform and repeal perhaps on their plate. What about cutting the Equality Act and returning to what we had before?
Well, I think
before, I mean, I find it interesting how these things are often talked about as with, say, the ECHR, things that are actually relatively recent. 2010, that's the dying days of the Gordon Brown administration. It's talked about as if these are inalienable rights without which we will have nothing. And a lot of people, Keir Starmer referred to it as un-British, which I found quite interesting. Or rather, not the Equality Act, but to axe it as if Britishness is defined by whatever Harriet Harman felt like doing in the last few weeks of Gordon Brown's time in office. There's a danger here, which is that it might frighten the horses, and the opposition have already seized on it and are, as they do with ECHR, telling people that they'll be completely devoid of rights, as if, prior to 2010, we were this kind of wasteland, anarchic place.
Well before we had the current crop of equalities legislation that occurred between 1997 and 2010, it's entirely true that we had a framework to protect people from active discrimination in the workplace of a kind that might be motivated by racism or worse. We weren't living in some form of, anarchic dystopia in which the rich and the wealthy were capable of indulging all of their prejudices in order to consolidate their own position. It's just not true. You're absolutely right. One of the bad things is that a sort of positive duty is placed on all sorts of bodies. The public sector equality duty, which means that organisations can be found wanting if they don't meet certain abstract criteria of equalities of outcome. And we've seen with equal pay legislation the situation in Birmingham, whereby people who are doing hard and physically demanding work, which arguably, I certainly think, should be better rewarded than less strenuous work, that the pay differential between those two is thought to be inherently unfair, and therefore you have a situation where you have leapfrogging pay claims, and you also have the concept of political judgment and defending that political judgment subordinated to a legal framework that everyone has to meet, and I think that's wrong.
I think you're absolutely right that where it's gone too far, I think, is when it's taken what most people would conceive of equality and turning it, and a sort of mission creep takes place, where actually what's happening is not true equality as people would understand it, but as you say, a very partial understanding and actually quite a political judgment. After all, had women wished to become bin men, for example, they were at perfect liberty to do so and may have chosen not to do that. And also for these judgments to apply retroactively, this is bankrupting multiple councils around the country. And I also think there's been, with the public sector duty, it has led the way for what some would call positive discrimination. But I think, to borrow Keir Starmer's earlier phrase, un-British, the idea that, for example, the Bank of England can now have an internship scheme from which all white men are excluded, even if they come from the most working class environment imaginable. And therefore, I don't know, a privileged woman like me would get to leapfrog a guy who went to a failing school in a deprived part of the UK just because he's a white man. I don't think that's what most people conceive of equality at all. So I think there is definitely common ground and ways for it to be extremely popular. But I think just kind of going in without a firm plan will frighten the horses and maybe hand a bit of a gift to the opposition.
Completely. And so what you have is a form of uber liberal-leftist overreach in this legislation, which has led to an entirely understandable backlash. Exactly as you say, you have different forms or different visions of equality or fairness, which are incommensurable. In other words, you seek to achieve one form of what you perceive to be social justice by favouring one group, and then another group loses out thereby. And then you have a society divided on the basis of which group are you, and can you make a louder and louder claim for your group? So is it middle-class women or working-class men who are most in need of the state supporting them in what might otherwise be an unfair system? You then create this whole new hierarchy of lack of privilege. So you say you believe in equality because you disapprove of hierarchy. Then you find that someone through this process that they call intersectionality, possesses the maximum number of, quotes, protected characteristics. Therefore, they're the most oppressed people ever, and therefore they're in the need of greatest state support. But then someone else thinks, actually, do you know what? I can invent some new characteristics that I have. I can emphasize my neurodiversity or whatever it might be. And so things that certainly might be considered by anyone thoughtful and kind in making judgments become iron rules governing the state, but it also means that you have an auction between groups to say, I'm a bigger victim. No, I'm a bigger victim. I need more state help. And you have both a celebration of weakness and an auction for more and more state control, both of which are the opposite of civilization.
Well, completely. There's also, I think, a lesson here for what has happened to the Labour Party. You have a situation where the Labour Party has become overwhelmingly a middle-class and increasingly graduate party, while neglecting its traditional working-class voting base. Although many did turn out for them at the last general election, that was as much of a screw you to the Tories as it was any kind of natural affection. It looks like they may have once again turned their back on the Labour Party. And now, having neglected that base, the Labour Party are now pandering in a really explicit way to sectarian interests as a means of, buttressing what is left of their core vote. And I think the clues are there in, for example, the way the Equality Act has ballooned from what it perhaps started out with very noble intentions of preventing a baseline level of discrimination that all sensible people could agree on.
Yeah, totally. And
into this thing that is overwhelmingly focused on immutable characteristics but has nothing to say about class, for example.
Precisely. And again, the aim originally was to consolidate in, as I say, a sort of rationalist, utilitarian fashion, all of the different qualities and characteristics that individuals have, which were protected by separate pieces of legislation, into something that was seen to be fairer. But as you've pointed out, far from removing distinctions, what it's done is create an energy behind finding new distinctions in the new assemblage for Labour of a rainbow coalition, from which the people who are most conspicuously excluded are those people who are traditional working class voters. So you have this, curious inversion. I'm tempted to say that in a different way, maybe what we should have is an inequality act in which someone legislates to make it clear that hard work, effort, application and virtue will result in some people succeeding more than those who engage in idleness, vice and self-obsession. And that will inevitably mean that society is unequal, that we'll do our very best to support those who lose out in that process. One's tempted to call it the Jordan-Peterson Act. If anyone has any suggestions on how we might improve our legislation so that we can have an inequality act that actually supports merit and a broader sense of procedural fairness, I'd love to hear them. And of course, Harriet Harman, my great friend in the House of Lords, is more than welcome to make her submissions as well. This podcast is sponsored by the new film, October 8. October 8 offers a look at the real-life impacts of the 7th of October on the lives of Jewish people and the eruption of anti-Semitism on college campuses, social media, and in the streets of America, beginning the day after the attack on Israel by Hamas. Through meticulous investigation, the film also uncovers how, over decades, Hamas created sophisticated networks in America to permeate US institutions, and it examines the tsunami of online anti-Semitism and disinformation unleashed by Iran, China, and Russia, all with the goal of dividing American society. This is a vital wake-up call about the threat of extremism against democracy. October 8 is available to buy or rent now on Amazon Prime, Apple TV, and Google. Our final question this week is from Dennis, and Dennis asks, are there any right-wing leaders around the world that you admire?
Good question. I suppose it has to be current living. I can't have Lee Kuan Yew
No, if Dennis were asking us for historical figures we admired, then we might be here
for
all week. So
several
he is,
days,
I think, restricting
About
us
a
to
7-hour
currently active
mega
living leaders.
podcast.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So there's Central South America. There are a couple who I admire very much. I know that our countries are not exactly the same, so it's not potentially the exact template that we might follow. But I think Nayib Bukele, president of El Salvador, achieved an astonishing feat in actually managing to break up the drug cartels, something that people felt was impossible. And he did this by locking up the wrong-uns. Who knew that you can just lock people up and crime stops? Astonishing. What will they think of next? Considering where El Salvador was just a few years ago, one of the most violent countries in the region, and now one of the safest, it just proves in the same way that I think similar to Lee Kuan Yew, that you can bring a kind of civilizational change by following clear principles and probably ignoring some of your naysayers and just getting on with it. Javier Milei, again, wouldn't do everything exactly as he does, but to have a budget surplus in Argentina, again, an extraordinary feat that the naysayers probably didn't think would happen. It was predicted to be economic catastrophe. So I think maximum credit to those two. Otherwise, he's not a leader, unfortunately, because Donald Trump shafted him last year before the federal elections. But I'm a big admirer of Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Canadian Conservatives. He's really fascinating as a politician, and I suppose it's something that the Conservative Party in Britain could only dream of. But I watched him speak earlier this week, and it's really interesting how he is pro-capitalism, but also in a way quite populist and very the working class and working people. He tells a story which I don't see anyone really in Britain even attempting to do, about how sometimes it's the big state, but also the crony capitalists and the vested interests that can squash the interests of the ordinary person. So he's managed to achieve this, and he has a lot more support than, as I say, the Conservative Party in Britain could only dream of. And most intriguingly of all, he has a huge following amongst younger voters in particular, because he's explained how vested interests will, for example, prevent them from achieving what they want to. So NIMBYs stop you from having your home. Governments printing too much money damages the value of the money in your pocket, inflation. And so he's really good at explaining how these things can work. And I don't agree with everything he says, but I think he's very good at persuading and telling a compelling story, which I feel some politicians on this side of the pond have basically stopped trying to do, and just going with what does the latest focus group or poll say, how do we copy that?
Pierre Poilievre has been in the UK this week, and he spoke at the Centre for Policy Studies. It gave Margaret Thatcher a memorial lecture. I didn't see it, but I did read it, and I agree with you. It was very impressive. And he's impressive on the stump, and the pitch that he's made, pro-worker, anti-vested interests, strongly pro-free market, and strongly pro-British, I find faultless. So I certainly think he's great. I mean, I think that you are right that he lost the elections in Canada, which he was apparently nailed on to win, because the Trump intervention came at just the wrong time for him and just the right time for Mark Carney.
Yes. And Trudeau left at the right time as well. But
exactly,
he might, I think, were it not for Trump, he might still have edged it.
Oh yeah, no, and I think there's every chance. I mean, you never underestimate Mark Carney, but I think that the Liberals in Canada have been in power for quite some time now. So I think Poilievre has the chance of potentially winning the next election. Just away from the Anglosphere for a second, and away from the Americas for a second, in Europe, there are certain political figures whom I admire, some currently leaders, some not yet. So I'm a big fan of Giorgia Meloni. I love her. I think she is wonderful. I think that what she's done in Italy, again, robustly right-wing on borders and crime, pro-Christian civilization, supportive of Ukraine against Russia, fan of both Roger Scruton and J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yeah.
I think she's great. Italy's economy seems to be doing very well. We touched on Dubai as a source of competition for London, but actually Milan is proving an attractive place for tax exiles as well.
Particularly after the inheritance tax changes that Reeves brought in.
Exactly. There's someone who I think our listeners probably won't have heard of, they may have done, who I also think is brilliant, equally, if not more controversial, who is a woman called Sarah Nafo. Knafo, who is running to be mayor of Paris at the moment. She is clear, robust, culturally conservative, pro-free market. And, if I were in France, I would normally vote default for the Gaullist or Republican candidate. But as the candidate for mayor of Paris, I do recommend that people have a look at what she's saying. I think she's great. Two other male European politicians who I like, also in France, Bruno Retailleau, who was the interior minister. He's a proper Gaullist. He's also a very keen countryman. If you can imagine, as it were, a French Charles Moore.
It's impossible to imagine such a thing. It does not compute.
Then that's Bruno Retailleau. And then in Germany, a guy called Jens Spahn, who was their health minister. He's a CDU figure, but he's one of the few CDU figures who unambiguously says not that they're a Christian Democrat, but that they're a conservative. And I think they're all great. But I also have one other right-wing leader whom I admire, who, if you can guess, Maddie, this will guarantee that I will alienate many of our listeners and readers.
Oh, okay. Alienate many of our listeners. So I'm looking for a right-wing leader that will be widely disliked by...
A right-wing leader who is hugely controversial. Even when people say that they
Trump.
Admire his country, they often pause and say, but not his government.
It's not Trump, is it?
Nope. Bibi Netanyahu.
Oh.
So the standard thing amongst people who are supportive of Israel is to say, I support Israel, but not the Israeli government. I totally understand that.
I see your point.
A very important distinction to draw. However, it is so fashionable to hate Bibi Netanyahu. All I would say is, in a nutshell, after October the 7th, he essentially drew the teeth from Hamas, defanged Hezbollah. He was responsible for ensuring that Iran's nuclear arsenal was targeted and set back.
Killed many civilians.
He is certainly not flawless, but I think if you consider the strategic position that Israel was in and the strategic position it's now in, and alongside that, Israel's economy continues to be resilient and its society continues to be free. And I know that there will be furious denunciation, but I am a great fan of the babysitter.
Oh my God. He shouldn't have... Too many people have died for him to have that cute nickname.
It is a name that he had from a particular advert that they had in Israel, where you have a couple who are worrying about who will keep their family safe.
Oh, God.
And he's the guy who is presented. What? And the key thing is, I remember this conversation with an American in the context of Trump, which is, when choosing a president, I don't want a therapist, I want a bodyguard. The point being that people, certainly his supporters felt, and he won that election, that you could make an argument about the security provided in a, for want of a better word, homespun way. From my point of view, the single most important thing, and here there's a contrast, of course, with Starmer, that a prime minister can do is to make people in that country feel safe and secure because of the solidity of his leadership. And again, one of the things I would say about Israel, one can argue that more and more countries will feel this way, is that it is better, Machiavelli style, to be feared than loved. And if you're in a rough neighborhood, that sometimes means some very, very difficult decisions. It was interesting this week that Macron said, in order for France to be safe, France has to be strong.
Yes.
And for order for France to be strong, it has to be feared. And he was saying this as he was celebrating, if that's the right word, certainly marking the increased investment that France is making, not only in its independent nuclear deterrent, but in its army overall. And as has been remarked on, France has an aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean and several other vessels, while our Type 45 destroyer is still in port in Portsmouth.
Oh my God. We can't defend our own airbase.
Quite.
It's just the humiliation. And also the projection of confidence, because it's really fascinating. The PR, not only I think is France in a much better strategic position, and has been for basically the entire post-war period, I would say. It's also the comms around what's going on is so interesting. You know, there's been these sort of PR'd photos of Macron flying in a jet surrounded by other
Oh, yes.
a kind of flight flotilla, and the marking of the submarines, like Marseillaise and all of this stuff. And meanwhile, we've had our Prime Minister just put out a video that looks a bit like a kind of cut scene from The Office or something, where he's speaking to various people over Zoom, always clutching his folder very close to his chest and consulting his notes and saying, hello, Friedrich, hello, Emmanuel.
Exactly.
You know, there's no sense of leadership at all. It's just waiting for someone else to speak to him and constantly deferring to other better leaders.
There are two juxtaposed images of this week, which are national images. One is of Macron leading French civilians and military in a chorus of the Marseillaise in the shipyard where the nuclear submarine is being inaugurated. And the contrast is with British parliamentarians practicing their cha-cha-cha in a Strictly Come Dancing dance-a-thon in Portcullis House. Now, some people have looked at those two contrasting images, and some people have said, oh, you know, what's wrong with people showing a certain degree of being game in Britain? But I do think that it probably is unfair. But those two images, I suppose if you're a certain sort of person, you can say one of them shows the certain blithe and good-natured maintenance of a British sense of fun versus the pomposity of the French. But actually, I think what it does show at a moment of crisis is a robust patriotism on the part of the French and increased frivolity on our part.
It's a terrible combination that we always have of a kind of horrible twee veneer mixed with national decline. And I think that Strictly video summed it up better than almost anything I can think of.
Yes. So on this occasion, I fear, it's Britain #decline and France #Vive la République.